Thank you, Susanna, and thank you to the Institute for inviting me. Um, I will offer an interpretation of two shocking events through which we're living now. The war in Ukraine, the length of which is measured in months, and the climate crisis, which is measured in years and decades. The talk is in 5 parts. First, about the causes of the war and the causes of the climate crisis and how these are related to each other. Second, about the crisis of the Russian petrostate. Third, about the Western powers' relationship with that state. Fourth, about the so-called energy crisis. And finally, about ways that society might push forward the transition away from fossil fuels. So first, how the roots of the war and the roots of the climate crisis are tangled up together. Let me first say this about the character of the war. It is a one-sided war of aggression, waged overwhelmingly on Ukrainian territory, aimed at the Ukrainian population as much as against the Ukrainian army and the state. Russia's war aim is to subjugate Ukraine, which for centuries was Russia's largest colony. My own attitude to the war is based on the principle that victims of imperialist attack have the right to resist it. I hope that by contributing to funds raised by Ukrainian friends for equipment for soldiers, or to legal teams who defend Russians arrested for anti-war actions, I hope I'm being consistent with the support I tried to give to Vietnamese resistance to US aggression in the 1970s, or to Palestinian resistance to Israeli apartheid. Politically, I see Ukraine in the same light. The obvious difference is that while Vietnamese and Palestinian people faced the world's most powerful imperialist nation and or its client states, Ukrainians are being terrorized by an imperialist power in decline, one that in its relationship with global capital is economically subordinate. Now, one of the Kremlin's justifications of its war is that it fears the growth of the NATO military alliance. While obviously this fails as a political excuse for murdering and torturing Ukrainian civilians, in my view, it also fails as an explanation of Russia's relationship with the Western powers. To understand this relationship, an obvious place to start is with the breakup of the Soviet Union 32 years ago, after which Ukraine and other former Soviet republics became fully independent from Russia for the first time. Russia, Ukraine, and other former Soviet states were rapidly integrated into world markets. In the early 1990s, they experienced the worst peacetime slump anywhere ever. Russia was then, as now, one of the world's leading exporters of oil, gas, and metals. Western capital mostly sought not to take ownership of these assets, but to turn Russia into a supplier of raw materials to world markets. During the 1990s, the Western powers had feared that the Russian state might collapse. When Vladimir Putin succeeded Boris Yeltsin as president in 2000, those Western powers welcomed him as someone who could make the state function effectively again. Putin's first act was to crush the separatist forces in Chechnya, the republic in the southern part of Russia. Those separatists had defeated the Russian army in 1996 and achieved a measure of autonomy. Putin ordered that army to attack Chechnya using the scorched earth tactics against the civilian population that are now used in Ukraine. And the Western powers fully supported that action as part of the so-called war on terror that they were themselves waging in Afghanistan and Iraq. Putin next turned on the so-called oligarchs, the politically powerful businessmen who had taken control of oil, gas and metals companies. He made them pay some taxes and warned them to stay out of politics. Some assets, most notably those that made up the oil company Rosneft, were taken back into state ownership, and control of these assets was handed to Putin's former colleagues from the security services. During Putin's first 2 terms in office, from 2000 to 2008, oil prices were rising constantly, and the Russian economy boomed. The fall in people's living standards that they had suffered in the 1990s was reversed. During those first 2 terms, Russian capital flourished, not because it developed industrial or technological capacities, but thanks to the huge windfall it received from exports of oil, gas, and metals. The revenues from these exports were largely re-exported. The big problems that worried Russian economists then were capital flight and the so-called resource curse. Politically, the Western powers saw Putin as a gendarme to protect capital's interests in the former Soviet space. Russia was welcomed into the so-called G7+1 of the world's strongest capitalist powers. Now, it was at this time that NATO expanded into Eastern Europe. 7 Eastern European countries were admitted in 2004. And there were even discussions at that time about Russia joining NATO, although these came to nothing. Nevertheless, the Western powers were happy for Putin to wield power in the former Soviet space as he saw fit. For example, they turned a blind eye to the invasion of Georgia in 2008. Now, the world financial and economic crisis of 2008 to 9 was an important turning point. Russian capital was shaken, living standards across the former Soviet space stagnated and started to fall again. There were big protest movements in Russia in 2011 and 2012, which Putin's regime struggled to control. All this instability culminated in the so-called Maidan uprising in Ukraine in 2013-14. The overthrow of President Yanukovych, the appearance of separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, Russia's military intervention in support of those forces, and Russia's annexation of Crimea. And at this point, the Western powers did intervene to discipline their gendarme, Putin. Sanctions were imposed on Russia, but they were limited. And these measures, these sanctions, did not dissuade Russia from intervening in Syria in 2015-16 to support the war being waged by Assad's regime on its own population. Events there showed that while the Western powers pretended there were no so-called spheres of influence for competing imperial armies, these spheres of influence existed in reality. Now, only in February 2022, as a result of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, did the Western powers abandon their policy of limited cooperation with the Russian government, their policy of using Putin as a gendarme. Now I'll explain why I see these dynamics, which led us to the war in Ukraine, as related to the dynamics that have taken us into the climate crisis. The International Treaty on Climate Change was signed in Rio in 1992. It was before that, in the 1980s, that climate scientists had reached a consensus about the dangers of the greenhouse effect and the fact that human economic activities, principally the burning of fossil fuels, were the main cause. 1992 marked the point at which the evidence was so strong that it was accepted by all the world's governments. The Rio Treaty provided for action to be taken to prevent dangerous global warming, but none was taken. The US and other powers resisted the principle that nations should adopt binding targets to reduce their emissions. The myth was invented that market mechanisms could be used to make the necessary changes, although the only such mechanism that might have had some effect, a global carbon tax, was rejected. This myth about market mechanisms was the basis for the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, which provided for so-called emissions trading. The result was that greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel combustion have risen every single year since 1992, except for brief pauses in 2009 due to the economic crisis and 2020 due to the COVID pandemic. So the volume of greenhouse gases that goes into the atmosphere each year is now more than 60% higher than it was in 1992. This is a disastrous failure by the world's strongest governments, for which society as a whole will pay a terrible price. Perhaps it can be compared to the failure of the European powers to prevent the First World War in 1914. Now we can look back to the 1990s and the early 2000s and see the political context for this failure. The Soviet Union had collapsed, reinforcing capital's illusions about its own power. Globalization was turbocharged by electronic technology and the expansion of offshore financial zones. Neoliberalism was in its heyday, waging war on regulation and on Keynesian direction of economic policy. And in this world, climate policy had to be subverted by climate science denial. And Russia mattered only as a source of oil, gas and coal, which by 2008, it was pouring onto world markets in record quantities. Putin was seen as a guarantor of those flows. The political tension with him was seen by the Western powers as a price worth paying. And that calculation only changed in February 2022. The underlying driving force of these processes was the capital accumulation and the need for constant economic expansion that characterizes capitalism at this stage of its development. So now I'll talk about the crisis of the Russian petrostate. If we accept that the Russian state under Putin is a creature of capital in the way that I've described, if we accept that it's a gendarme that has swerved out of control, then we can better understand its actions. I'll make two brief points about this. First, a central function of the Russian state, like all states, is social control. If we think about how the world looked from the Kremlin in the years leading up to the invasion of Ukraine, such control was desperately needed in their eyes. On top of the Maidan uprising of 2014 in Ukraine, there was in 2020 a huge national revolt in Belarus against the fixing of elections. And in 2020 and 21, there was an upsurge of protest in Russia itself. In January 2022, there were labor disputes and street disturbances in Kazakhstan that shook the government there. It seems that ultimately Putin's decision to invade Ukraine was triggered by his failure to push President Zelensky back on issues of Ukrainian sovereignty. But these social movements were also of great concern to him and are part of the background to his decision to invade. The second point about this is that in times of crisis, states are driven along the road of authoritarianism, the promotion of nationalist, xenophobic, neo-fascist and fascist ideologies, and imperialist militarism. These are political and ideological tools of social control. They're used to mobilize sections of the population behind the regime, or at least to secure the acquiescence of the population. And under Putin, these tools have been used increasingly. And as imperialist militarism has moved to the center of statecraft, we've seen the use of quasi-state military formations. The Wagner Group was the largest, but by no means the only one. And this approach has culminated in the armed rebellion last month and deepened the instability of the regime. Now, the use of these ideological tools cuts across the state's functions of economic management. Over the last decade, Putin's government has time and again sacrificed efficient management of the capitalist economy for the sake of this politics and ideology. The oil industry, the largest source of export revenues, has by and large not been affected by this, but the gas industry has been. It was for decades a key part of the trading relationship between the Soviet Union and then Russia with Germany and other European countries. And now that relationship is broken. From the 1990s to 2021, there were constant conflicts about gas between Russia and Ukraine over the terms under which Ukraine would buy gas and transport it to Europe. These started as mainly commercial disputes, but became increasingly political. The end result was in 2016, Ukraine stopped direct purchases of Russian gas. The Russian gas industry lost its second biggest export market after Germany. Now, at that time, in 2016, Russia's gas sales to Europe continued, despite the sanctions imposed after the annexation of Crimea. In 2022, in response to the all-out invasion of Ukraine, Germany and other countries did not impose sanctions on Russian gas, but they said they would move away from it, buying it over a period of years. The Russian government decided, perhaps in the hope of causing divisions among European states last year, that it would itself cut off most gas deliveries to Europe. Gazprom, the large state-controlled gas producer, halted deliveries that it was committed to under long-term contracts. So in a few weeks, by the decision of the government, relationships between Gazprom and the big European energy companies that had been built up over decades were destroyed. In June last year, Gazprom reduced the flows through the Nord Stream pipeline, which goes under the Baltic Sea, to zero. The pipeline was blown up in September by persons unknown. But when that happened, it had had no gas going through it for 3 months. This self-sanctioning of gas exports is the latest and most significant manifestation of the Russian government's tendency to undermine Russian capital's commercial interests for the sake of its ideologized nationalist and military goals. So the third part of this is about the Western powers' efforts to control but not destroy the Russian state. While Russia's self-sanctioning of gas has quite effectively destroyed an export business that took so long to build up, the Western powers' sanctions on Russian oil exports have been largely ineffective last year. The price cap of $60 a barrel set in December last year has resulted in Russian oil exports being rerouted to India and other Asian countries. Trading companies have devised new schemes to rebrand and resell the Russian oil. Because the price of oil was so high last year, revenues to the Russian budget were also unusually high. And it's important to underline that the ineffectiveness of these sanctions is partly the result of deliberate policy decisions. So when the tighter sanctions were being prepared, some European governments suggested sanctioning European-based shipping and insurance services on which Russian oil exporters rely heavily, and these cannot easily be substituted. But the US government intervened to stop such measures because it was worried that they would push global oil prices to a level that would endanger post-pandemic economic recovery. Now, other sanctions, such as those on the export of various technologies to Russia, have been more effective, but they have little impact on immediate cash flows. They take time to produce results. The sanctions imposed on financial flows have also been patchy. It is now in practice almost impossible for Russian banks to access funds from international markets, or from the Western international markets, I should say. But many of the mechanisms for storing and hiding the Russian bourgeoisie's wealth are still operating fine. Russian anti-corruption organizations are still churning out reports month after month about war criminals whose assets and family members are completely untouched by these sanctions. In my view, the conclusion is that the sanctions are designed not to bankrupt the Russian government and not to stop it from exporting oil, but only to limit its room for maneuver and to discipline it. So now I'll talk about the fourth part of this. I'll talk about the so-called energy crisis of 2022 as a mirage that served corporate power. The combined effect of Western sanctions, Russian self-sanctions, and market volatility last year produced a sharp spike in gas prices and an increase in oil prices. There were fears that the shortage of gas supplies to Europe would result in some rationing in the winter. But these fears were not realized. Now, the same problem could, of course, be replicated this coming winter. Furthermore, for the longer term, the Western powers stated their determination to reduce their dependence on Russian oil and gas supplies. And most, although not all, of the large Western oil companies have said that they will sell or close down their oil producing operations in Russia. Now, politicians and company executives presented all this to the public as a, quote, energy crisis, unquote. We need to question this term and the discourse around it. And here are 4 reasons to question it. First, the most serious effects of the war were not only about energy, but apart from the horrendous destruction in Ukraine itself, these effects were A, the human cost to millions of people who fled Ukraine as refugees, and B, the impact on food markets, in North Africa especially, due to the constraints on Russian and Ukrainian exports of agricultural products. Second, the increase in retail prices of gas and electricity for households, especially in Europe, resulted from decisions by large energy corporations working in liberalized markets, and from the decisions of governments who regulate those markets. The influence of the war was only indirect. Some governments actually decided to protect households from these impacts, and all governments could have done so. Third, energy corporations have profited from these events to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars. The 5 largest Western oil companies alone made $134 billion in profit in 2022. But there's more than that. A recent survey of the oil exporting states in the Gulf estimated that their current account surpluses for 2022 were in aggregate more than $600 billion. These governments are literally wondering what to do with all the money. Fourth, and most relevant to the climate crisis, all the claims about, quote, energy crisis, unquote, assume that there is a fixed level of demand for electricity and fuels, and that this must be met at all costs. This is perhaps the most dangerous deception of all. Take the most acute shortage caused as a result of the war of gas for Europe. Research institutes in Germany last year produced detailed reports showing how investment in insulation of buildings and heat pumps to reduce the amount of gas used for heating, investment in renewable electricity, and changes to gas-intensive industrial processes could slash gas demand. Within 2 or 3 years, these researchers argued, savings could be made equal to the volume of Russian gas imported by Germany. This was a great opportunity to introduce radical policies to move away from fossil fuel dependence. Policies that are anyway many years overdue because of the need to avert dangerous climate change. The Western powers, far from embracing this opportunity, on the contrary, chose to redouble their commitment to fossil fuels and to invest in new oil and gas supplies from non-Russian sources. So in the year up to October 2022, companies in Europe commissioned enough new terminals and equipment to import enough liquefied natural gas to more than replace all imports of Russian gas. The US, which exports liquefied natural gas, approved enough port facilities to double its export capacity. Governments also cynically used the so-called energy crisis to approve big investments in new oil fields, such as the Willow field in Alaska, that's the United States field, and the Rosebank field in the North Sea, which is in the UK. Now, these oil fields take years to develop, and so these fields will not be able to produce any oil for 5 or more likely 10 years at the earliest. So they will make no impact at all on any shortages that are caused by the war. They will, however, add to the problem of global warming at a time when the International Energy Agency, the United Nations, and climate scientists are warning that no new oil fields should be commissioned. These decisions tell us about the real intention of governments who claim to be dealing with the climate crisis. They intend to keep burning fossil fuels long after the point where it should stop. if dangerous global heating is to be avoided. This is a frightening prospect, and we need to find ways to resist it. To return to the point I made at the start about the relationship between the causes of the climate emergency and the causes of war, in the 1990s and 2000s, the overriding drive of capitalism to expand at all costs shaped the way that the Western powers embraced Putin and his team as keepers of order, who could oversee the integration of Russia with global markets. Restraining that team's imperialist nationalism was the last thing on their minds. And it is this same drive that has led them to fail catastrophically to find any strategy that could implement the reduction in fossil fuel use, the need for which was recognized in the Rio Treaty of 1992. So the fifth and final part of my talk is about ways that society can push forward the transition away from fossil fuels. Now, the process of the international climate talks that followed the Rio Treaty has not only failed to slow down the relentless increase in fossil fuel consumption and the emission of greenhouse gases, it has also been used as an ideological tool to produce a discourse, to convince society that the world states are taking care of the problem. In the last few years, the dangers of global heating have become more evident to millions of people because of alarming changes in the weather. And many hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions, of very young people have expressed their deeply held concerns about climate change in school strikes and other actions. All this has put a strain on this discourse surrounding the climate talks. The distance between words and actions is just too great. And so on one hand, we see the talks now being taken over still more openly by oil companies, with the president of this year's talks in the United Arab Emirates, Sultan Al Jaber, head of the Emirates' own state-owned oil company, resisting any discussion about reducing fossil fuel burning and talking instead about carbon capture technologies that cannot solve the problem. On the other hand, we see more and more vocal attacks on oil companies by some senior figures associated with this process. Because despite being politicians, they are also human beings and know that a fraud is being perpetrated. So Antonio Guterres, the United Nations Secretary General, attacked Al Jaber's proposal as a means for the oil industry to, quote, become more efficient planet wreckers, unquote. Now, I give this example not because I think that Guterres can show us the way forward, but because I think the discourse around the international talks is breaking down. It is failing to achieve its ideological purpose. It is failing to convince us that the governments have this under control. In my view, the talks process and the governments who participate in it are the problem, not the solution. And the solution needs to be found by society in opposition to these governments. Now, that's a very general statement, and no one action or one policy is going to work. This problem has been with us for many years and will be with us for many years to come. In my view, the most hopeful sign is that there is potential to form a wide coalition embracing the young people that I mentioned, the labour movement, wide swathes of civil society, and the climate scientists, many of whom have spent sleepless nights for years worrying about climate change, but up to now felt isolated because their appeals to politicians were ignored. Now, I would say such a coalition could base itself on some key principles. So I'm just going to suggest 7 such principles, and that's the end. So the first of these is to demand that governments adopt carbon budgets, not net zero targets. Net zero is a perfectly valid scientific concept, the idea that we need to reach a state in which the volume of greenhouse gases pumped into the atmosphere minus the volume taken out, for example, by forests, is 0. But this concept has been misused by oil companies and their friends, who have put political pressure on scientists to include completely unrealistic projections of artificial removal of greenhouse gases in their scenarios. This is essentially what the tension between Guterres and Al-Jaber is about. Now, carbon budgets can avoid these problems by stating the amount of emissions to which any country's economy should be limited in order to ensure that dangerous climate change is avoided, and assuming 0 artificial greenhouse gas removal. Okay, second of these 7 points, these carbon budgets must be worked out on principles of equity between the global south and the global north. The rich countries, who are historically responsible for the vast bulk of greenhouse gas emissions, must not only make the biggest, fastest cuts in fossil fuel use, but also make provision for its impacts that are already being felt in the global south, so-called loss and damage. Third, society must stop by any means necessary new oil and gas projects and new fossil fuel intensive infrastructure, such as roads and airports. Fourth, the basis of future energy provision must be electricity produced from renewable sources. We should work towards this energy being provided as a right, as a service, not as a commodity, by publicly owned entities. While big solar and wind farms will surely be part of the future system, decentralized sources controlled directly by communities and municipalities should be used to the extent that it is technologically possible. Fifth, we must systematically challenge big corporations' claims that technical fixes, for example, the large-scale production of hydrogen or the replacement of petrol cars by electric cars, are the main means to solve the climate crisis. Sixth, green growth is a fiction, and the idea that green growth creates jobs that are the best working people can hope for is a fiction. Against this, we need economic policies that underpin the transition, both away from fossil fuels and towards creative, meaningful work. The 7th and last point is that policies must be prioritized which reduce the throughput of fossil fuels while improving the services that they provide. The insulation of homes to reduce or avoid the need for artificial heating combined with electric heat pumps is one example. Another is the development of urban transport systems that supersede, with public transport and changes in urban design, the use of private cars in cities. Finally, it's important. I don't know how these ends will be achieved, but I can make some general points. I'll make three general points. First, it is important not to pretend that everything will be okay in the end and to promote false optimism. Millions of people have had their lives ruined already by climate-related weather events, and millions more will suffer, whatever happens. At the same time, we should not lose hope. The process of transition away from fossil fuels needs to happen in a very short timescale in historical terms, 2 or 3 decades, but it can be done. Second, civil disobedience will play an increasing part in this movement. We are seeing this in the UK and Europe, and we are also seeing increasingly authoritarian policing of such protests, and this conflict will intensify. Third, we must focus on the many ways in which policies can simultaneously move away from fossil fuels and also change the way we live for the better. Tackling climate change and living better lives are not contradictory. They're the same. If we do not put this idea at the center of the actions we take, we will never mobilize society as a whole around this issue. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Professor, nós queremos lhe agradecer muito pela sua exposição. Nós já temos 5 perguntas, mas podemos abrir a mais perguntas para quem quiser também interagir. A primeira pergunta, eu vou ler devagar para que o tradutor possa também fazer a tradução. Professor Pirani, muito obrigado pela sua exposição. Gostaria de ouvir sua percepção sobre o papel da China, tanto na guerra russa-ucraniana, quanto nos movimentos governamentais frente à mutação climática. O que podemos esperar deste país nos próximos episódios do atual contexto geopolítico e climático?
Thank you for the question. I think with regard to the war, I think that China is serious in its declaration that it wants to negotiate peace. It has contacted both the Russian and Ukrainian governments and made that very public. Cynical critics of China could say that this is merely because it has realized that invading other countries is not as simple as it looks, and has learned a lesson about its own preparations for aggression against Taiwan. That's a possible interpretation. But nevertheless, whatever the motivation, I think the Chinese government would really like to see an end to the war in Ukraine. And the problem will be on what terms such an end could be negotiated. As for the climate issue, China has become the largest single consumer of fossil fuels. It consumes more, it overtook the United States as the #1 consumer of fossil fuels about, I think, 10 years ago now. And China is still building large numbers of coal-fired power stations. And this coal boom in China is not only about supporting or improving it's not only about improving the lives of Chinese people. Much of this coal is burned in order to supply industry, and industry then supplies consumer goods to the rich countries in the West. And that is the relationship that has developed between China and global capitalism over the last 20 years or so. China is building wind farms very quickly, but it's also still building coal-fired power stations. What I hope is that people in China will find a way to an economy which works differently from this coal-based export-based economy that China has developed so far. And I think it's significant that there's a Chinese scholar of sustainability, Deng Yingtao, who wrote a whole book in the late 80s, mapping out an alternative path for Chinese development. Tragically, that path was not followed, but he started that thinking, and the thinking about how such a path could be developed is there.
Obrigada, professor. Temos uma segunda pergunta que pede se poderia explicar mais sobre a relação da crise energética com a governança corporativa e estatal e o capital financeiro. Aí depois continua a pergunta: os conflitos, escassez de recursos por sanções, imigrações políticas e climáticas, seriam novos elementos de acumulação para estas companhias?
The discussion around the international climate talks is very much centered on where is the investment capital going to come from for the construction of renewable electricity generation. Where is the capital going to come from to reform industries? And of course, corporations, their first instinct is to look for funds that they can access from state or interstate sources for their businesses. So, for example, car manufacturers are hopeful that they will be able to access subsidies from the state in the different countries where they work to manufacture electric vehicles. This is, if you read the reports of any of the big car manufacturers, this is their perspective for the coming years. Now, of course, anyone who studies greenhouse gas emissions will tell you that the saving that can be achieved by everybody changing their petrol car to an electric car is very small. I mean, it depends in which country you're in. If you're in Paraguay and all the electricity comes from hydro, then yes, it does make sense for everybody to have an electric car. But if you're in India and the electricity comes from coal, it's actually better to keep with your petrol car and not throw it away and have an electric car. But the car companies don't care about that, in my opinion. They care about shifting the manufacture of cars onto a new track, the electric track, so that they can carry on making money and developing their business. And I think we'll see fights of this kind all over the place. I think the other kind of fight which is going on now through the process of the international talks is the fight over money for countries in the global south to fund the sort of development that will be needed to move away from fossil fuels. And the funds that are being offered are, I'm trying to think of a reasonable word. They're very, very small indeed. The rich countries of the global north have repeatedly promised to add to these funds and repeatedly failed to meet those promises. And this has been going on since the beginning of the 1990s. So I mean, these are all reasons why I think what we're looking at is a real crisis of the whole system. And these are the reasons why I think the idea that market mechanisms can be used to solve the climate crisis has to be questioned.
Obrigada, professor. Vamos, então, à outra pergunta, que diz assim: qual o papel dos governos no controle da estrutura do mercado da energia? Monopólios, oligopólios, etc. A escala e estrutura de produção de certas fontes de energia pode ser reformulada? Como o senhor vislumbra a transição energética para hidrogênio verde, energia solar ou eólica, por exemplo? Quais os principais desafios e possibilidades desta transição?
Yes, I got it. Yep, thank you. It's a big question. So I think it would be very difficult to generalize about the role of governments. The example that I spend a lot of time thinking about is our government here in the UK, and I see my colleagues who work on similar subjects tearing their hair out because the government says one thing and does another. So when the climate talks were here in Glasgow at the end of 2021, our government was very anxious to advertise itself as being on the front lines of dealing with climate change. And they talked about the move away from oil and gas. But as soon as the war started, as soon as the Russian invasion took place in the beginning of 2022, so a few months later, the government issued an energy strategy and said, to get away from Russian energy, we need energy from elsewhere. And they announced that they were planning to make available licenses for new oil fields in the North Sea, in the UK sector of the North Sea. Now, of course, this I mentioned it in my talk. This cannot make any difference to the war, because these fields will not start producing oil for years. And all the documents on this by all the climate scientists are saying that there should be no new oil and gas, and particularly that oil and gas production should be phased down in the rich countries fastest of all. And that includes the UK. So the UK government is doing the very opposite of that. And it's noticeable to me that the UN Secretary General, he's not a particularly radical politician, is condemning these governments who are taking these decisions in ever more strident terms. Now, I suppose the big question, and I'm not sure I can really answer it, but a big question is, do we think that the policy of the United States government, because that's obviously an important one, do we think that their policy with the new Inflation Reduction Act, which includes a very, very big program, billions of dollars of new spending on, quote, green, unquote, economic projects, is this a better example? Is this an example of a government that's doing better than the UK government? I mean, what I see colleagues from the United States saying is they are not sure. Too much of this money is going into problematic technologies. There's too much talk about capturing carbon after it's been put in the atmosphere. When again, any climate scientist will tell you, look, just don't put it there in the first place. There are too many get-outs for American oil companies, like the oil field that I mentioned, the new development in Alaska. So I think the answer is that's probably not a good example either. And I think that, you know, the horrible reality is that it's difficult to find good examples. You asked about the different technologies. On solar, I must recommend to you a book called How Solar Became So Cheap. The author is Gregory Nemeth. And I just read this very, very good book because he explains how solar has developed from really nothing to where it is now, which is, it's still a very small part of electricity generation on the world scale, but it's a lot bigger than it was 20 or 30 years ago. And he goes through the various governments, started in the States, then Japan, Germany, now China, and he goes through the various countries which have one by one taken an interest in solar for different reasons. And it's ultimately quite an optimistic story. And finally, sorry, I'm giving you a long answer, but it was a big question. So I think the final point is that we, and I've spoken about society, not leaving things to governments. So I think we, society, need to be very critical about the various technologies. The part of the reason I was reading that book is because I think solar power is one of the most important potential technologies for addressing the climate crisis. You mentioned green hydrogen, and I think that's much more problematic. It's fine if somebody is going to use renewables and produce hydrogen with them for, you know, perhaps making steel or for doing things that it's difficult to do otherwise without gas or coal. But there's a problem, which is that in the real world we live in, there are so far not so, there is so far not much electricity being produced from renewables. There is huge amounts of electricity being produced by coal and by gas, and that has to stop. So if there was a logical government, that government would first reduce the amount of coal and gas being used for electricity generation, and only after that allow the use of hydrogen for other purposes. And this, so to take India as an example, and I've done some work with an Indian colleague about this, which we published recently. India has announced a big green hydrogen program, very ambitious, but India is still producing a huge amount of its electricity from coal. And there's no sign in the documents that the government have produced so far of how it thinks these things should be prioritized. Again, a problem is capitalism, because the companies that think they might be able to develop a hydrogen business are not the same ones as the ones that are generating electricity from coal. Each company is trying to do its own business. In India, they do have a tradition of planning. In energy. And indeed, if it was not for that tradition, there would not have been a huge increase in electricity access in India over the last 30 years, which has been a great achievement. That hundreds of millions of people in the countryside in India now get electricity where they couldn't before is a great achievement. But there needs to be planning with respect to hydrogen. That's what we're arguing. That producing it from the problem with green hydrogen, the problem with producing hydrogen from renewables, it takes an awful lot of energy to produce that hydrogen. If you put 10 units of electricity into your electrolyzers to electrolyze your water to produce green hydrogen, you immediately lose between 2 and 3 of those units. So then the hydrogen comes out and the energy content is probably 7 of your 10. And then people talk about using the hydrogen for transportation and storage. If you transport that hydrogen to somewhere else, you lose another 1 of your 10 units on the way. And then if you turn that hydrogen back into electricity at the end, burn it in a power station or a turbine and produce electricity, I think you lose at least another 1 of your 10 units. So you have to ask, would it not have been better to just keep that electricity in the grid in the first place? And if you need it in another location, send it down a transmission line where then you lose 1 of your units, but not 5 of your units. So that is a non-engineer's explanation of some of the problems.
Obrigada, professor. Temos outra pergunta que diz: segundo os seus estudos e seus temas de pesquisa, o que o Estado, o governo, representa hoje para a sociedade um obstáculo? Por que o senhor aponta para a dicotomia povo versus governo? Há necessidade de criação de novas organizações e reformulação das instituições atuais?
Yes, I got it. Thank you. Well, thank you for the question. And I cannot give you a full answer. I've been thinking about these things for many years, and I'm sure other people on the call have also been thinking about these things for many years. And of course, you have a much experience in Brazil, which is not the same as experience in a relatively rich and peaceful country like the UK. Politically, I'm a radical socialist. When I was younger, I was very optimistic about the possibility of superseding the state, of going past it, of creating societies which did not use that form of organization. I saw the state as a means of defending the power of capital and of doing so violently. And I still think that. I mean, you know, let's just look around the world. Look at what's happening in France. Look at what's happening in Jenin, in the West Bank in Palestine. Look at what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, the state is a weapon to defend the power of those who have power and those who have wealth. I think the problem is, you know, how to go past that and how to create forms of democracy which can go past it. And that's why I say I don't have any. That's why I say I don't have any easy answers. A group of socialists, friends in the 1990s in the UK, produced a very famous discussion document which we all read and talked about, and they talked about going against, past, and through the state. And they said, okay, we don't have to have illusions, we don't have to put all our energy into a parliamentary party, but we can still, at municipal level, for example, we can try to take part of this state machine and use it for our own purposes. It turned out to be very difficult. And of course, you've also had the history in Brazil of the first government of Lula, which worked with similar ideas. So, yeah, I don't know the answer. I do absolutely see the very repressive role of the state as it still remains. And I also see the crisis of statehood in front of the climate problem. I mean, this in my view, tells us a lot about the state. It tells us about its limitations. I think so if we go back to the Rio Treaty, I have some friends, radical socialists, and they say, it was just talk. It was just talk, it was just promises. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. I think when they signed the Rio Treaty, they were listening to the scientists and they understood that there was a big problem. But the states collectively, the largest states, have completely failed to deal with that problem. That's why I made the comparison when I was talking with the years before the First World War. I mean, the German, Russian, French, British states did not say, okay, yeah, let's send millions of young men to be killed. They didn't. It wasn't a conspiracy that they all got together. It's not what happened. They failed collectively to work in such a way as to defend the interests of capitalism without such a horrible, destructive war. Now, some people will then say, well, there was no way, and that's the inevitable logic of capitalism. So now it seems to me, to be honest, we're in a similar situation. This is a real crisis. They know it's a real crisis, and they know then they are not dealing with it. And that's why I find the speeches of the UN Secretary General Guterres very interesting. I mean, he sounds extraordinary when he talks. And he makes these attacks on governments and attacks on oil companies. This also suggests he doesn't know what to do.
Professor, obrigada. Nós temos uma última pergunta que está formulada da seguinte maneira: as políticas econômicas devem também ser responsáveis pelo descontrole consumista atual? Qual a importância do comportamento consumista para retardar ou acelerar a transição energética?
Yes, thank you very much for that question. So I think we need to first distinguish between consumption and consumerism. And I spent quite a bit of time trying to think about this when I wrote the book that Susanna, you mentioned in introducing. I do not think it is. I am not going to say to my fellow citizens, you have to reduce your consumption of things that you need. I do not believe this will solve the climate crisis, and I do not believe it's necessary. But of course, the question is, what do I mean when I say things you need? And this raises the issue of consumerism. Since the Second World War, society has changed in such a way so that hundreds of millions of people in North America, in Europe, in Japan, in some of the other rich countries, hundreds of millions of people have a level of material consumption which is very, very far above just what they need in order to live. Very far above. And to some extent, we've seen the middle class in countries such as Brazil and India, China, Russia. We've seen those sort of consumption habits also spread to those some people, a minority of people in those countries. I mean, that's what's happened. And I think this is a big part of the problem. I mean, I think that fossil fuels are consumed through big technological systems. It is not, I do not agree with those environmentalists who paint a picture that it's the responsibility of the individual consumer. I think that's wrong. The individual consumer did not invent this way of doing things. He or she lives in a world where it's easier to have a dishwasher than to wash the dishes by hand. It's easier to have an electric hoover than to sweep up with a broom. And it's easier to, and the most important one for women in the rich countries, and I think probably for many women in Brazil as well, the most important one is the washing machine. It's easier to wash the children's clothes with a washing machine. Now, so we have to find a way out of the climate crisis which does not prevent, which does not negate the social change that has come about because women have washing machines and hoovers, so they can start to live a more human life. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that there are sides of consumerism which are incredibly wasteful. For example, I mean, you can all think of examples, right? Do we really need all those military jets? Do we really need all those sports utility vehicles? One example which struck me very hard is that McDonald's has made an announcement that it's going to make sure that that the toys that it gives away to children in the McDonald's stores, they are going to be, McDonald's says, quote, sustainable, unquote, by 2025. Now, each year, McDonald's makes 1 billion of these plastic toys. And a sociologist in the States, in the United States, Juliet Shaw, did some research on this some years ago And she found, and this is not just McDonald's, this is all the companies, that in the United States, in a particular year, I think this was about 10 or 15 years ago, for each child, there are 69 plastic toys. Now, I have grandchildren. I don't want them to go short of anything, but those guys don't need 69 toys each year. Really, they don't. And so I think your question is very valid about consumerism. I support the campaigns, for example, against private jets. I think we should find ways to limit luxury air travel. I think we should find ways. If I was in the government, which I'm not, and I'm not going to be, if I was in the government, there would be some regulation of cars. I mean, even if all my plans about urban transport come to fruition very quickly, there will have to be cars. You know, doctors will need cars to go and see their patients. But really, there's no need for SUVs. There really isn't. So I thank you for your question, and I suppose just because we're ending now, I mean, I should say that I think that these things are very important, and I think that about consumption and consumerism, and I think we have to discuss them. We have to. I've always found there's a tension between the environmentalists and the socialists on this issue of consumerism and consumption. We should get over the tension. We should find a resolution, because the problem is actually much bigger. The problem is about capitalism and its technological systems, and how it's ruining the planet with those systems. And I think we can put aside our secondary differences and concentrate on that big problem. So I think I'll stop there. So thank you all again for listening to me, and thank you for inviting me.